The impudence, the audacity, the unmitigated gall of those Knuckleheads of Liberty podcasters, daring to voice opinions outside the mainstream of accepted thought. Listen if you dare. It's angry, it's funny, it's even sometimes sad, but it's always based on freedom and justice, as you will see. Here's our host, Jason McPhee.
It is March 13th, 2023, and welcome to the Knuckleheads of Liberty, where we are bringing you the people and the organizations fighting for liberty around the nation and in your region. And today we have a special guest with us, Tony Woodlief, and of the State Policy Network. He is the Senior Executive Vice President there, and he's going to be joining us to talk about a show focused on barriers to right to work in all these different states going on. But before we get into that, let me introduce you to the rest of our panel. In our upper left-hand corner, we have Leon, the word Brathwaite, last word in Liberty. He is a retired engineer in the state of California. And in our lower left-hand corner, we have our screaming eagle of freedom, Tim Everett. He is a pilot in the state of California. My name's Jason McPhee, and I'll be your host today. So talking about barriers to right to work. The first one I wanted to get into is something that we're a little bit familiar with here in California. And James, maybe our invisible hand, you could bring up the thing. So we had this crazy thing that the legislature passed back in, I think it was 2019, that took effect in 2020, called AB 5. And essentially it was an anti-gig work. So they're just not comfortable, these guys like Newsom and other Democrats, with the idea that you may be out there taking gigs as you feel like them. So if somebody calls you up and says, hey, you want to come down to the bar and play a few sets for us, you want to come over and drive a car and pick somebody up, the idea that if you do that more than just a handful of times, you have to become a regular employee of that person, where you have to file paperwork and all that kind of stuff, that raises a significant barrier to employment. It's such a bad idea that that made Biden think it was such a good idea the way these kind of things work, that he wants to take this thing national. So that's just sort of the way these things work. If it's just a horrendous idea coming out of California, the Democrats seem to want to bring it to you nationally. So you guys have any thoughts on this? It just seems like a needless barrier to work. And by the way, here's NOLO's page as well that talks a little bit about this. They call it a gig worker law, but it's really an anti-gig worker law.
Remember, they always name them the opposite of what they are.
Indeed. The
Inflation Reduction Act, for example.
Affordable Care Act. Yeah.
Affordable Care.
Yeah.
Yes, Affordable Care.
The Patriot Act.
Yeah.
When you guys want to jump in on AB 5, or essentially it's just jumping in and saying that the government wants to create a barrier between you and somebody else making an arrangement. So go ahead.
Let our guest go first, please.
Yeah, Tony, go ahead.
Oh. Well, it's one thing I think, you keep in mind, if you see something like this, it's usually helpful to ask, all right, who's really driving this? And you probably have some thoughts about who might be driving it. You've got some companies, I guess, like FedEx, that are more reliant on contractors, and other companies like UPS that are more, they have more full-time workers unionized by the Teamsters. And, so you can imagine the companies and industries where you've got unionized full-time employees, they don't like competitors who can rely on part-time labor and gig labor. And the other part of it that I always keep in mind is there's a freedom. If you're able to, build a living for yourself through various gigs, you have a freedom that many people do not. They're beholden to one employer. They're beholden to that insurance, the health insurance they get from it. You can be trapped and held more compliant that way. So people out there selling their wares to all kinds of different providers, they have a freedom that many don't. And I think that threatens large, overweening governments.
What? Go ahead, Tim. Tim, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I just found this out this past week, that FedEx is over 60%. Basically, they hire companies to do the work for them. They're not actual employees of FedEx.
Yeah.
And that's getting larger and larger and larger. So, for example, I work for a different company from FedEx, but I fly FedEx airplanes, moving FedEx freight, and work with some FedEx employees that offload the freight and put it on and take it off. But so they're going more and more. Their truck drivers are not independent contractors. They may work for a company that is subcontracted by FedEx. So, but it's still kind of, it's still, that doesn't take anything away from your point. I'm just trying to clarify that.
No, that's helpful. Yeah.
But at a more fundamental level, I mean, the question that I think we should be asking is, from where does the government get the authority to define the relationship between me and a potential employer, or not even, or whether that relationship is informed in the form of a direct employment, or that relationship is through an independent contracting relationship. I was an independent contractor here in California, but that was my choice. I chose that, and that was fine with me. I have a son who does a lot of work, independent contracting work, and the government comes in and they made these new rules and mess up all the relationships between myself and my potential employer. And in many cases, some of these people have lost work because of it. I think my son has. I'm not sure about that, but I think he has lost work because of this new definition of these relationships. But from where does the government get the authority to do this? This is my question. I mean, I think our Constitution said that the Congress shall pass no laws that will interfere with the formation of contracts. But I guess that's at the federal level. But I would think that the federal Constitution should apply at the state level also, where it's still a relationship between us and the government. And I just, for the life of me, cannot understand why they have the authority to redefine relationships that are voluntarily engaged into.
Well, the minimum wage is that's interfering in contracts between two people, and my humble opinion, should be abolished. But for economic reasons as well as constitutional reasons. And there is a federal minimum wage, however, and then there's all these state minimum wages, and then all of it is interfering. It's basically making low-paying jobs illegal, is what it does. And so anyway, so there's an example. So I mean, yeah, and the whole gig thing, the whole definition of what an independent contractor is, and under the law, the tax laws that I've been familiar with throughout my time as an employer myself, is pretty cut and dry. I think the gig workers may have, the only issue may simply be that they're working under an apparatus that was formed by a different company. So they run a little bit afoul of the typical definition of an independent contractor, but I don't know that it goes so far as to make them an employee either. So, in other words, they could have come up with some kind of legislation that would have fit them into a little narrower category, and not had them become W-2 wage slaves, and then all that, and all for this pie in the sky nonsense about protecting them from the minimum wage and from overworking and, and being paid for overtime, blah, blah, blah. If somebody wants to work overtime and just get paid their normal amount, then, let them do it,
Well, I think where a lot of this came from was with Uber and their challenge to taxi drivers, and so if we think about this, is essentially a perversion of permitting laws, is where all this came from. Because imagine needing permission from the government to say that, hey, somebody wants to pay me to get in my car and go somewhere. Right. And that's literally what a taxi is doing. Right. But the government, made everybody take, buy these very expensive permits. They turned out to be these taxi medallions. And then, of course, I mean, people are literally paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for these rights to let somebody in your car to drive them somewhere, which is just insane. And Uber said, well, do we really have to take a taxi? I mean, what's to stop somebody truly from getting in my car and just paying me? Right. And so that's what this AB5 came out as, essentially you were a gig worker. If you were working for Uber, you just figure, well, I only want to work 2 hours today, maybe 5 hours on Friday, that kind of a thing. That flexibility is what the Uber was all about. Whereas a taxi company, if they're going to have you drive, they may want you to sit in that car for an 8-hour shift. And some people just maybe don't have the flexibility to do that. So this is just insanity on stilts. You have one perversion telling people that they need a permit to get in your car and go somewhere, or that you need to have a permit for that to allow that. And then consequently trying to crush anybody who figures out a way around that with this anti-gig law. So
meanwhile, the taxi cab companies had existed in a monopoly for decades and decades, and never came up with anything innovative at all, because they had it locked in. And why should they? Why should you not pay with a credit card, and they'll take out the little cha-ching machine and swipe your credit card to pay for the taxi ride? When Lyft and Uber came up with the idea of doing everything on your phone because of the new technology available. But did the taxi cab people ever think that up?
Looks like
incentivized to come up with innovation. And so Tony talks about how the people in the government never innovate, and he's totally right. But also people that are monopolized by government edicts like medallions, they don't have to innovate too. Why should they?
They have no incentive. They have no incentive.
None. Right. And until some new company comes along, and oh boy, was I relishing that whole moment when Lyft and Uber first came on the scene. And oh my God, finally, I get a affordable ride and then they're there in 1 to 3 minutes when I call them on my phone. And that's it. I don't even call them. I just send a text or however they do it. And they were there. So it was an awesome service. Awesome.
Let me segue real quick into something. And this is we're still on the same topic roughly, but just one of the harms. So James, could you pull up this image? One of the things that a lot of these crazy laws hurt is actual people who, maybe migrants or people with low skills who are trying to, essentially pick themselves up. And this article from Reason essentially showed that a lot of these occupational licensing laws are these restrictions to work. Essentially, they come down and they slam Hispanics the hardest. Which is, clearly that doesn't sound like the rhetoric of what the Democrats are after, but that's what the effect of what they appear to be getting. And if you think about it, who's most likely to be doing a job like a taxi job where it really doesn't require a huge amount of skill? It's likely to be maybe migrants who are coming to the country who don't have to have a huge amount of, language skill, in English and other things, just to get behind the wheel and drive somebody somewhere. And you're going to put up barriers to them to do this type of work, or other things. So do you guys want to jump in on that aspect of it?
Well, there's a very long history of this sort of thing. You talk about these laws impacting Hispanics, and in the article also talk about the impact upon blacks and that kind of stuff. The Democrats love to talk about something called desperate impact, where certain laws may affect different demographic groups differently. And in that cases, then it's supposed to be illegal for such things to happen. But they never look at laws that are affecting any one of their constituents, any one of their major campaign donors. They never look at these things. You see these laws that having these desperate impacts or having different impacts on different demographics. This go back to the 1930s when they institute laws. It was the Davis-Bacon Act. They institute laws specifically to prevent blacks from coming north and gaining employment in the north. I mean, it was specifically designed for this purpose, okay? Where there was a member of Congress who got on the floor of I think of the House of Representatives and said something to the effect that look at these Negroes coming north and they're taking jobs from the white man. Now, listen, the problem is that they came up, the special interest in those cases were the unions. The unions wanted to protect their members and protect employment of their members. And then the government got involved and they passed this Davis-Bacon Act that is today is still on the books. Mm-hmm. They have this thing called prevailing wages. It's really become union wages now, prevailing wages. And the only thing that does is to prevent, is act like a barrier to entry so that people an employer will not find it economic to hire someone at a prevailing wage, but that person might be willing to work at a lower wage. But they can't do that because the Davis-Bacon Act now forbids, on federal contracts I'm talking about here, forbid you from hiring at lower wages. You could only do so at the prevailing wage, which is the higher union wages. And these things about all these restrictions we see, it goes back to the 1930s with the Davis-Bacon Act. It is really an atrocity that is occurring.
Yeah. I think you think about disparate impact, at least back in 2018, Hispanics in the U.S. are about 18% of the population. Right. 25% of all new business owners. Immigrants overall are responsible for about 30% of startups. So you've got this strong entrepreneurial impulse. And so if you're going to start trying to, crack down on people who are working as contractors or who start businesses who are employing contractors, you're hurting the people who are at the bottom of the ladder trying to make their way up.
Exactly.
And you end up with this kind of structural unemployment like Europe, 20% of young people not working, and that's not good, as we all know. So, I mean, my Democrat friends are wondering, how in the world is anyone Hispanic voting Republican? Well, because they're starting businesses. 25% of the kids in this country under the age of 18 are Hispanic. And what's the Democrats give them? They give them Latinx, right? They give them COVID lockdowns that are destroying their businesses. The virtual schooling that's hardest on two-income families, low-income families. And then they're just shocked. How could they do this? How could they betray us? Well, because you're betraying them.
Yes. Yeah. And even, and just as a side note, I mean, even the thought of the Democrats asking that question of how could Hispanics be voting for the Republic or shifting to the right or voting Republican and that kind of stuff. Even that question to me sounds so racist you wouldn't believe. Yeah. As if your skin color should determine your thoughts or your feelings about certain political issues that are before us in our nation. It just sounds so racist to me. It's unbelievable. But you're absolutely right about it.
Does it verge on racism, Leon? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying it sounds racist, and it is.
All right.
Well, one of the things too about all of this, crazy barriers to work that they keep putting us through is these occupational licensing laws. A lot of times this means they're putting up boards and other things that are trying to set standards of some kind of barrier to entry to keep you from being able to enter a field. And that's one aspect maybe where there's some kind of a safety thing that maybe might make sense. But in a lot of cases, these are just silly things like, the idea of haircutting or, flowers or doing, like you say, driving a taxi and some of these things. But it's not just these, barriers on that basis, but they can be abused in other ways too. And James, maybe we could bring up the visual on this. In Canada, they're using these occupational licensing laws to silence people. So essentially, if you don't speak the right political lingo, you won't have permission to work in that place. And in the case of Jordan Peterson, he had retweeted some tweets that were critical of Justin Trudeau. He's also been outspoken on the issue of these gender pronoun mandates that they have in their country as well. And so they want to take away his clinical psychology license to be able to treat people in that country, which is just absolutely insane. I can't think of anything more authoritarian than this.
Oh, yeah. It's like the Chinese Communist Party and their social credit system.
Yes.
The same idea. It's exactly the same idea. I think often the sort of progressives, or I don't even want to call them progressives because that used to mean something that in some ways was, I thought, quite respectable. But the people who call themselves progressives now, they look admiringly to these dictatorships because what drives them insane is that we will not comply. It makes them furious. And,
of course.
So,
well, and most prominently, I was just going to say, jump in. Justin Trudeau literally was in an interview where he said how much he admired the Chinese regime.
And it's encomium for Castro. Remember, because his father was buddies with Castro, I guess. So he had nice things to say about Castro too. That tells you everything you need to know about him.
Indeed.
Yeah.
But this thing, we know how to go all the way to Canada, Jason, quite frankly, I mean, it's relevant to our discussion. But right here in California, we know about the incidents involving doctors where they're trying to take away the license of doctors if they don't speak the right narrative, the government-approved narrative about COVID. Or you remember that I think that it became law, or they were attempting to pass law. Yeah. So the government is using the use even to the point of violating free speech rights to try to get at whatever mandates they want.
Beyond free speech, but the doctor-patient relationship. The American Psychiatric Association's done the same thing as far as sort of gender dysmorphia. It's the one illness you can now self-diagnose, and your psychiatrist is not allowed to argue with you or even ask you hard questions, or he or she could lose their license.
Yeah. In fact, if you recall, we had an attorney on the show about several months ago who was actually they were representing some of the doctors in this case here in California, where they are resisting those ridiculous edicts to essentially get between you and your doctor. So your doctor essentially can only tell you what the state approves to be told to you.
Could imagine that.
And the very same people say that relationship is sacrosanct when the topic is abortion.
Yeah,
but if it's all these other matters, they're happy to jump right in there with the full power of the state to tell you what you can tell your patient. So,
that's such a good point. Tony, I'm sorry, but I'm going to steal that one, and I'm not going to give you credit.
we're just trading here. This is all free, gains from trade. There's no right of ownership. I'm sure I heard it from somebody else.
Oh, okay. Well, I just heard it from you.
And another issue that's a little more nefarious too on all of this, it's not directly occupational licensing, but it's this degree inflation that's happening. And a lot of it's because of the distortion that we've had in funding a lot of these colleges with government money. And essentially, we're seeing where people who one day did not need a college degree in order to get a certain job. Now they're essentially competing. Everybody has a college degree. Even your bartender has a college degree. I mean, your taxi driver may have a college degree. Everybody. And so consequently, that's sort of this inflation of degrees that causes everybody to have to cross this extra barrier that the state has almost imposed on people. And they haven't directly imposed it, but by funding all of this, they sort of had. And I want to bring up this graphic here. This is from American Public Media. And they have this little graphic here of let's see, where was it? I think this is it right here. And this says the percentage of the workforce that required these different levels of degrees over time. And so you can see in 1973, you had 32% of workers essentially could have been high school dropouts, and over 70 over about 62% of workers, I guess, could have just had high school diploma or less. Now today, that's down to 38%. So I mean, essentially, this whole purple and blue area, you got to have some kind of higher education in order to get these jobs. I mean, who does this impact? This impacts people who are migrants who are coming from different places, people who maybe are disadvantaged and didn't want to, take out those huge college loans to go through college, so that the government was handing out, knowing that at some point they might have to pay them back. So, and people maybe who maybe were in a community where they might have been more impacted by the criminal justice system are less likely to have these degrees as well. And it's kind of a terrible thing. And I thought I'd bring it up too. We talked about this on a recent show when we interviewed a gentleman from Pennsylvania, but the governor there was trying to make a difference on this, at least with respect to government employment. One of his first steps was as an executive order to just say, hey, you know what? A lot of these government jobs really don't need all of these degrees that people are, that we're saying they need. And so, you can see maybe some issues with that one way or another, but certainly it's good that he's at least having some skepticism on this issue. So I think that's a good point. Did you guys want to talk about this degree inflation issue?
Well, I think it's an elaborate welfare system for college administrators. I mean, we've pumped all this money into the system. You talk to people like my parents' generation, they didn't go to college, but people in that age range, they'll tell you you could work for a summer, roofing houses or whatever it is, and you could pay for your tuition for the following year, and you could work through college basically. And they have priced it completely out of reach. And it's one of the handful of things where you see this tremendous inflation and no increase in quality whatsoever. So what's happening? Well, the money flows from the feds, right? They back all the loans. It's the only kind of loan that you can't get out from under with bankruptcy, which is another sop to that administrative, university class. And so they drive up the price and then you have to borrow the money. It's just this kind of self-fueling game. Then who benefits from it? Not regular people.
No, I will play. I mean, Tony's probably got the majority of why these degrees are required more and more. But some of it, if I play devil's advocate, is because we're becoming more and more specialized in our economy, which is a good thing because that's how our economy progresses in general. Is people do more specific and specialized jobs as the economy flourishes and more technological change, improves the standard of living. So there's some of that. I don't know what percentage. I'm sure, it's Tony's brought up the majority of the reason behind it. But to play devil's advocate, I think there's also a push just from specialization, which is a good thing.
Well, Tim, I would see that point in inserting some of the STEM fields, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I can see some of that really and truly. But what we have now going on in the college level, honestly, quite frankly, is people's gender studies, studying these are the degrees we get in gender studies, African American studies, Asian studies, tribal studies, blah blah studies, all kind of studies.
Very specialized field, by the way.
Very specialized that give you zero marketing skills. So when you look at the non-STEM fields, you're not really seeing any great improvement in marketable skills. So many of these the state employment, many of those they accept these degrees as real degrees, and these people are then employed in the state. I mean, maybe now we can understand why we get such moronic decisions and mandates and actions by the state because of the kind of people they have hired. I mean, I used to be a state employee, so I'm going to say that. Okay, so Jason is one too. But the point is though, outside of the STEM fields, they are not adding to the human capital stock of our nation. Right. So I can see the need to really and truly get rid of some of these degree requirements for state jobs in particular, I mean, I think private employers will have to work that out on their own, as they should. But in terms of state employment, you could easily get rid of a lot of those requirements, quite frankly, and you'll be no worse off.
Yeah, and actually, for example, airlines that used to have a hard stop at a 4-year degree are dropping that. Some of them are dropping that requirement, knowing that, you know, if some kid comes up and becomes a commercial pilot and just never bothers to get a degree, doesn't mean he's a bad pilot. It could be a really super good pilot. Doesn't have to have a 4-year degree in, you know, music, like one of my, you know, my first employer in aviation had, or business administration. You don't need it, you know, to be a pilot, you know, but so they're dropping it. So, and that's partly because we have a pilot shortage right now. So, you know, employers will go up and down with their requirements depending on their labor market at that particular time.
Sure. And something else you have to keep in mind is the employers use the college degree as a legal form of discrimination. So it's you can sort of rule out a subset of people that you wouldn't hire anyway, but you don't want to face any kind of sort of racial discrimination charge or that kind of thing. And so if you say, well, the college degree is directly connected to the requirements of the job, you sort of can wipe out a swath of candidates you wouldn't want and get away with it without having to worry about the government coming after you and saying, well, you're discriminating against people. So they have kind of an incentive, as long as universities have some discriminating process themselves. But if you get to a point where pretty much anyone can get a college degree, then companies lose that kind of hidden benefit that they don't talk about.
That is such a valid point. You know, again, I'm going to steal that one from you. Okay, Tony?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you know, we're starting to go over a little on time, and so I want to go through this last bit rapid fire here, and get Tony's response to this, because as we just saw with this Pennsylvania, executive order, there's been a lot of actions happening in other states. In fact, I pulled this one as a link off of the State Policy Network's page, but here, Louisiana Commerce Committee approves occupational licensing reforms, and I believe some of these might have had something to do with allowing people who I believe might have had criminal backgrounds and other things not to have to be barred, I think, from some of these. I may be mistaking that on this one, but that's one of them. Ohio, we talked about this in a different show. They're essentially passed something that will allow the state to much more easily accept licenses from other states. So, I mean, this is a great thing, because then, you know, you can more easily transfer from one place to another. Virginia is looking at some occupational licensing reforms as well, trying to, I believe, also accept some of those standards from other states more quickly. And Pennsylvania is trying to loosen some of these rules to not discount people with criminal backgrounds. I mean, I can't think of something, if you're trying to get your life back in order, after paying your debt to society, and then the government's going to tell you, well, sorry, we're not going to give you a permit to work. I just can't imagine, but what are you going to do? But as far as the State Policy Network goes, I mean, are you guys, is this, are you guys tied into a lot of these efforts going into actions at the state level all over the place?
Yeah. So our model is, we're not going to tell the state-based groups what to do, but we pulled together working groups of people from different think tanks who have different interests: education, occupational licensing, healthcare reform. And then what we can bring to the table is we can do like the heavy lifting of, let's say, polling and focus groups. So that, for example, you want to do education reform, stop talking about school choice and start talking about parental choice. Why do I say that? Because the polling's very clear that the latter resonates more with regular Americans. Why do we know that? Because we spend a lot of damn money to find out with focus groups and polling. And so there's smaller groups, they can't necessarily get that kind of stuff, but we can get it and then share it with all of them. And then they can share their kind of marketing strategies and, social media strategies. So we bring them together to get them to kind of compare notes on their campaigns and data and everything else. And then they go out and make it happen in their different state capitals.
So, Tony, your state groups, the people that are part of your SBN, which I guess is a network, But your state groups, they are operating independently?
That's
Is
correct.
that what? They
That's
are?
right.
Okay.
We don't tell them what to do. We bring them together, and then they learn from each other, and we learn from them often. Like some of our innovations we take and try to spread to other groups. It's our best groups out front on stuff like social media, communication strategies, that kind of thing.
Got you. Okay.
Well, we're getting really, we're just about to the end of our time. And so I want to bring up our Knucklehead Noise Patrol. That's something where we try and bring something kind of ridiculous that somebody is saying. And this ties into the sort of the degree inflation that we've been talking about recently. And there's been, there's recently at the Supreme Court, there's an issue where Biden has tried to get this essentially free college for everybody. He wants to pay off everybody's college debts. And the Supreme Court is weighing that right now, whether he actually has the authority to do that. But, it really begs the question, there's all these people with all this debt and they can't pay it off. And that kind of makes you wonder, well, are these degrees actually worth the money if people can't pay the debt? But Bernie is actually kind of on this. And so we have a quote from him where he identifies the problem and then he'll tell you what his solution is. So James, can we bring up the quote from him?
Right now in America, we have 45 million Americans, young people, drowning in student debt. And I have talked to people all over this country who literally delay having a family, can't have any kids, they can't afford a car, they can't afford to have a middle-class life because they're drowning in their student debt.
So that's wonderful. I mean, Bernie has laid out the problem for us, right? Student debt is killing the young people. So what is Bernie's solution? Can we bring up the video for that, James?
In this wealthy country, we should understand that education from child care to graduate school is a human right. It should be free to all.
So apparently to Bernie, if something doesn't work, we'll just have the state pay for it and make it free for everybody.
We'll all be indebted together. Yeah. Let's go to 50 trillion in debt. Nationally.
Yeah, there we go.
Let's share the debt. He's identified the symptom. He hasn't identified the problem. He doesn't want to talk about the problem. But I think we ought to put the risk right back on the people who help generate it. Put it on the banks that are aiding and abetting these loans. Put it on the universities. Right? They'll change their tune when they have to wear the debt that they're helping pile onto these kids. They'll start managing the risk better.
Yes, and this gets back to the issue we had just raised here a little while ago, and you're talking about the value of these degrees, Jason. It's just the point. These people going to school, they're taking out these huge $100,000 or whatever it is they're taking out these days. I mean, I didn't think about that kind of money when I was in college, but they're taking out all these big, huge loans. And what they're going and study, they're not in the STEM fields for the most part, in the science, technology, and the engineering, and math. They're going to do gender studies, this studies, and that studies, and all these other damn nonsense, which adds nothing to the human capital stock of the nation. They have no marketable skills and they have this huge debt. And now the answer, according to Bernie now, is that we, the hardworking taxpayers, we should not pay for the damn nonsense that they did while they were in college. Come on. This is ridiculous. And Tony, I totally agree. We have to put the risk back on the people who's causing all of these problems, which is the banks and the universities themselves. If we put it there, I think they'll manage this nonsense a little bit better.
Because it sure as heck isn't free. I wish they would stop using the word free.
Exactly.
Because
exactly.
Yeah, I wish but that's like saying I wish they would name these acts more appropriately instead of the opposite of what they are.
Yeah.
But but instead of saying free, they should say education should be paid for by somebody else, not you. I mean, that's at least honest.
Yes.
But they can't even do that. Anyway, I'd be happy with that.
The sad thing is with all this is that it's once again something where government has come in and they perverted something that's sort of a good idea. The idea that, hey, look, there's these places called universities where smart people can get together and exchange skills and send people out, more capable to work in the world. The problem is government went in and shoveled a whole bunch of money to the point where the skills aren't being driven by market signals at all. They're just being driven by political signals, and turns out that most of those political signals are worthless. And of course, the last lesson that they don't seem to ever get is when you're in a hole, stop digging. they just want to keep on digging.
Right. They want the taxpayers to buy a bigger shovel.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, and the ridiculous thing about all of this is that some of us, had kids who went to college. My kids are now grown, but they both went to college. Okay. We paid it. We took out loans. We did. We refinanced our home. We did. We did all of those things to take care of our kids' education. And now they're telling us, well, Leon, you are a damn fool for doing that because the government could have paid it off for you. Jackass, what was wrong with you?
Yep, that's right.
Well, before we wrap up, I wanted to pull up the website for Tony's organization, the State Policy Network. Tony, did you want to give us any last words about that before we get going?
Well, just, we're where it's at. Liberty began in the states, and we think that's how we're going to get it back is state and community action, mostly against the feds to get them out of our communities and get them to back behind the river, obeying the Constitution.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being with us here today. And if you want to go find out more about Tony and his organization, we did another show. Go check that one out where we just interviewed him specifically about that. But thanks so much for joining us. And until the next time, stay tuned and stay free.
Yes, indeed. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, always and forever.
Thank you for listening to the Knuckleheads of Liberty podcast. Find us on Facebook, Rumble, YouTube, your favorite podcast network, and at knuckleheadsofliberty.com.